Thanks for tuning into our session on aligning to the NIST cybersecurity framework in the AWS cloud. My name is Min Hyun. I'm the global lead for the emerging tech trends and strategy team within AWS Security. Just wanted to go through just a couple of housekeeping items for you. We do have a repeat session tomorrow that's occurring at 11 o'clock. So for those of you who have colleagues or friends who've missed this session because it is 5:30, please feel free to relay this information to them. Thank you for being here. You really want to be here if you're sitting here at this hour. Just to level set and go through the agenda so that you know what this session will cover, including the altitude at which this discussion will happen. I will go through what the NIST cybersecurity framework is, including what's its intended purpose. Then I'll get into why would you use the NIST cybersecurity framework? What are some use cases? What are some sectors, organizations that are adopting the CSF? And then talk briefly through AWS's responsibilities, which will be manifested in our independent assessor validation. And then I'll hop it over to Michael, who will go over some architectural concepts and approaches. So if you're looking for a deeper dive, this is a 200-level intermediate session. Now would be the time where you would not crush my feelings if you silent discoed to any of the other sessions that are happening now. But I will venture to say that if you've had a conversation about the NIST CSF and you've heard terms like it's something that you comply with, or it's a standard, or you just turn on some services and you just give it a go, I think there are some things that you can take away from our session here. So I hope you stay tuned and that you get some good value out of it. So what is the NIST CSF and what was it actually intended to do? And the reason that I want to cover this is because a lot of folks apply the CSF but don't really understand what was the intention behind it. And I think that that will really help you to appreciate the thought that went into it and help you to understand really the criticality of the entities that were originally intended to adopt the CSF. So as many of you are aware, this is a voluntary framework, and it's comprised of best practices that enterprises in any sector of any size, in any geography, can actually adopt. And regardless of whether you are a cybersecurity guru as an enterprise or you're a small to medium-sized business where cybersecurity may be something new, this framework is actually intended to be flexible and relevant to your situation, and it's to help improve the security and resiliency of your organization. Another part of the framework is that it provides a common taxonomy. What we mean by that is you can actually use the language in the CSF not only to implement security best practices, but also to be able to talk to business leaders about it. And so instead of security discussions really being at the operational or the technical or the compliance level and it remaining there, it can actually cross over and you can communicate these things to senior business leaders. And so it really allows for that top-down, left-right discussion. You can use existing standards, so you don't have to create anything net new. The CSF actually allows for you to leverage frameworks, standards, other accreditations that are out there, and I'll unpack what that means. And then finally, many of you may not know that it was actually originally intended for critical infrastructure sectors. So you may be asking, Min, what's considered critical infrastructure? So critical infrastructure is actually a very particular designation that's given by governments worldwide. It's not just limited to the US. The definition that you see up here was issued by actually in law. And if you go across the pond, you'll hear designations of critical infrastructure more as essential services. But it's basically those assets, systems, or functions that are so critical to national security, public safety, or the economy that any debilitation of those assets, systems, or functions would have negative first-order impact to citizens. And so I hope that that definition really helps you to feel the gravity of what critical infrastructure is. And in the US, these 16 sectors are designated critical infrastructure. Now, I will say this. I know that DHS recently, in April, switched designation of critical infrastructure sectors to 55 critical functions. But that does not interrupt the application of the NIST CSF to those functions. I just did want to put a pin in that because I know that there are CIP gurus out there who may think, hey, this is not relevant anymore because DHS issued a new list. But I wanted to stay true to the context in which the CSF was created, and that's when we had 16 critical infrastructure sectors. So the backdrop. The CSF was actually created back in 2013 under an executive order. And so the context, we'll have to rewind and go back to 2012. What was the cybersecurity environment in 2012? Well, we had a lot of critical infrastructure sectors that were being attacked. DHS actually had an uptick in reporting by 52% in 2012. And also, that was the year when Cyber Command was stood up. And the then head of the NSA said that if he had to scale or give a number for the U.S.'s preparedness for a large-scale cyber attack, from a scale of 1 to 10, it would be a 3. So that's the backdrop in which the CSF was actually created. So President Obama issued an executive order that called for the creation of a voluntary framework for cybersecurity and resiliency. And the voluntary nature of it is important because the administration was not intent on issuing a set of requirements that were mandated that would be cumbersome, because critical infrastructure is owned and operated by private sector. At least 80% of it is. And so you can see the impact if the administration were to issue something that were mandated, and the regulatory burden that would create. And so on top of there being an executive order that was issued, Congress actually codified into law the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act. And what that did was it actually provided an extra level of validity to the creation of a voluntary framework. I know that sounds a little odd. Legislation actually codified the development of voluntary framework, but that's actually what it did. And the underscoring message there is it's intended to be voluntary, not intended to be a mandatory standard that would overburden organizations that were adopting it. And then with this new administration, there was actually a cybersecurity executive order that now mandates federal department and agencies to comply with the NIST CSF under their Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA, reporting. So I'll dive into that just a little bit. So what is the CSF? I'm going to go through the anatomy of what comprises the CSF. So just at the highest level, as I had mentioned, the CSF is actually intended to provide an outcome-focused, risk-based way for you to implement cybersecurity risk management in your organization. And the CSF is comprised of the core, which is the flagship, which many of you are familiar with. The core consists of 5 functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And these functions are going to be familiar to all of you because you've seen some instantiation of it, maybe different terminology, but just in practice, these functions are going to be familiar to you. An example of the 5 functions in action would be the federal department and agencies. As I had mentioned, all of their FISMA reporting requirements now align to the 5 functions in the CSF. So agencies, as they are doing their quarterly and annual reporting to the White House and to Congress, it is aligned to the structure of the core. The tiers. The tiers, you can think of it as a way to measure the sophistication of certain capabilities that you have in place. An example of tiers in action. So in the CSF, the tiers are 4 parts. You'll see it going from tier 1, partial, to risk-informed, repeatable, and adaptive. So you can see the evolution there in the tiers. What you'll note in practice is the inspector generals, which is basically the audit arm of federal departments and agencies. They've actually adapted the tiers so that there are 5 tiers when they're assessing federal agencies, and their tiering structure goes from ad hoc all the way to fully optimized. So that's an example of an organization that's implemented the tiers. And then finally, you have profiles. So profiles is really what's the state today, and then what's the desired end state. So a really cool anecdote about the profiles. So the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council, this is a public-private partnership that's comprised of about 70 financial institutions and exchanges, as well as the regulators. They actually came together and did a mapping. They actually developed a target profile specific for the financial services sector. So they basically, what that means is they took the CSF and then they customized it for financial services so that it's tailored to their requirements. And they, in doing the mapping, they actually found that when they mapped the risk management strategy category to 9 different regulatory requirements, it just all aligned into one. And so they're finding, in their own words, which I actually have a great graphic for it. I can't take credit for this. This is due to this. This is the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council. They found that there are 9 different regulatory requirements, but they all aligned to the same category. And the language may have been different, but the security objective was the same. And so this was a great opportunity to streamline and focus risk management for the financial services sector. So getting back to the flagship, which is the core, and the reason I'm diving into this is because it's going to set up the foundation for what Michael will dive into, and then also what our AWS white paper on the CSF is about. So the core consists of these 5 functions, as I had mentioned, and then you have these 23 categories that lives inside of these functions. And then you have 108 outcome-based security activities. So we'll drill down just a little bit more. So I actually took the identify function here, and then you'll see that then it gets a bit more granular. So then the category that you have here is asset management. And then the subcategory here are the individual risk-based activities that support the security outcome. And then finally, you have informative references, and these are basically standards, frameworks that map to the security objective that you want to achieve. You'll note that there's NIST 853, there's ISO 27001. These are some of the most widely used, internationally recognized standards and frameworks. And this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, it is meant to be an illustrative list. And so you can feel free to take whatever framework or standard and then do the mapping to the CSF, and that's exactly what the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council did. We're going to drill down just a little bit more. So for those of you who are in the compliance world and who are very familiar with the NIST 853 controls, for those of you who've never seen a control statement, ta-da, here you go. This is the level of granularity that you get. And you'll note that in a lot of standards and accreditation frameworks, what they do is they'll actually start with very prescriptive implementation practices. And then it goes, and then what it does, it limits the innovation, the latest security techniques that you can use to actually manage this outcome that you want to achieve. What's different about the CSF is it actually did a paradigm shift where it starts with the security objectives and outcomes, and then it is then supported by the risk-based activities, which then map to the standard or the framework. So I'm going to give you a very trivial example of what I mean by this, and this is arguably physical security. So I'm at the airport, I'm boarding my plane, I have my carry-on, my purse, and my laptop. You can only take on 2 personal belongings into the airport, but I've done it before where my purse and my laptop are discreet enough where it fits below, it fits beneath the seat in front of me. I've done this half a dozen times. I know the size of my purse, the size of my laptop bag. So I'm going in, unassuming, just trying to get past the agent. And of course, he flags me and he says, "Ma'am, you need to consolidate your bags down to 2. And I didn't want to tell him, look, I know it's going to fit in here, because that's the objective of it, right? You don't want to carry these, big bags that are not going to fit and then take up too much room so that you're being that passenger. So then, of course, I grumpily then take my laptop out, and then I squeeze my laptop bag in my suitcase. I get past the guard, and I literally, as soon as I passed him and I'm in the jetway, I take my laptop bag out, and then I just have my 2 and walk down, because I know it's going to fit in the seat in front of me. I know that was just a facetious example, but if you apply it to the security context, prescribing periodicity, prescribing frequency, prescribing, hey, your systems need to be synchronized in 6-second increments, the ROI to do that relative to the security value add is not going to be there. So just let me take my bags on board, because I promise it'll fit under the seat in front of me. All right. So hopefully I've given you some context for what the CSF is. You have a baseline understanding of it. What's the value prop of the CSF? What are some enterprises, sectors that are using it? So the healthcare sector. So the U.S. HHS, Health and Human Services, actually did a mapping of the CSF to the Health Information Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA. So HIPAA has a security rule. Covered entities actually demonstrate the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of protected health data by meeting the requirements in the security rule. There's no formal accreditation for HIPAA. You don't get HIPAA compliance. You can become HIPAA eligible. How do you show that? So they actually did a mapping to the CSF. And what they found was that the CSF was actually provided an additional layer of security because it had more details and specificity than the actual HIPAA security rule. So in this context, you have HHS saying that the CSF provides more detail, more specificity than the rule itself. The commercial sector, we went through the healthcare example. So we'll jump into federal agencies, and I already talked about federal departments and agencies and their FISMA reporting requirements already aligning to the CSF. States, there are actually over 25 states who are aligning to the CSF, and states right now are creating a state-specific overlay of the CSF. And there are countries such as those listed: Italy, Japan, Israel, Uruguay. Israel actually is developing their cyber defense methodology aligning to the CSF. The UK actually developed their minimum cybersecurity standards, again, aligning to the NIST CSF. And you have countries that have translated the NIST CSF into native language so that they can actually adopt it. We talked about some of the value prop of the CSF, but some things that I did not mention are there's no cost. It's absolutely free for you to do. What I like about the CSF is that it's intended to be flexible and adaptive. So you can take all three parts of the CSF, the core, the profile, the tiers, or you could piecemeal it depending on what your organizational need is. So according to Gartner, and this is a bit dated, so I expect the percentage to be higher. So by 2020, 50% of organizations will have adopted some form of the NIST cybersecurity framework. As of the release of our report, which was updated earlier this year, all 16 critical infrastructures are using the CSF. We have over 20 states that have implemented it. And then we talked about how federal agencies have also adopted it because it's mandated. So in that context, federal agencies can actually comply with the CSF. But in other contexts, unless there is an oversight agency or that requires it, you align with the framework. So you'll note in our white paper, we're very deliberate about saying AWS enables customers to align to the CSF because this is not mandatory. It would take away from the voluntary nature of the CSF. So you may be thinking the NIST CSF is great. NIST is based in the United States. They do a lot of international work. They may be internationally recognized. They may be widely reputed, but they're still based in the US. And this may be a non-starter for some governments or even organizations that are based abroad. What I wanted to do is highlight some international efforts that are occurring in the International Standards Organization that's helping to internationalize the CSF. So the first effort, this one, ISO 27103, this publication is actually final. And what this technical report basically says is, if you're going to implement a cybersecurity framework, go ahead and leverage existing standards. There's no need for you to redo. Why don't you reuse what's already out there? Because there are tested and effective standards and frameworks that you can go ahead and use. What the ISO 27101 draft is actually doing is it's going a step beyond, and it's saying when you develop a cybersecurity framework guideline, there are 5 functions that you ought to consider: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. And there are these categories and subcategories that you ought to consider. And it looks a lot like the CSF. And so what we're seeing here is an international adaptation of the NIST cybersecurity framework. And what this will hopefully do, the impact that this will hopefully have, is that organizations abroad will have that international banner and some form of attestation against under the international umbrella. And so this document is currently in draft. Following the ISO process, it's probably at least a year out before we can see something more final, but I did want for this audience to be tracking on this development. So our paper, for those of you who have not seen our white paper on the NIST cybersecurity framework, you basically got a primer on what's in the actual white paper itself. We take a 2-pronged approach. We talk about the security of the cloud and the security in the cloud. This is a very common narrative for many of you. And so what we did for in the cloud is the part that Michael will cover. He'll review AWS services that can help you align to the CSF. And then for of the cloud, what we did is we actually had a third-party assessor review our FedRAMP moderate accredited services, as well as our ISO 27001 accredited services, and they validated that those services align to the CSF. So we actually took it upon ourselves to provide you, our customers, that extra level of assurance that when you're using our FedRAMP accredited services or ISO accredited services, that they too align to the CSF. So you'll note that when you go into our white paper, we actually have a copy of the attestation letter as Appendix A. And in Appendix B, that's the part that Michael will cover, where there's an actual customer workbook. It's an Excel spreadsheet, 5 tabs associated with each of the 5 functions, and then a drill down of AWS responsibilities and the customer responsibility. And so this is just an overview of how you would use the white paper itself. It's intended to resonate with the executive level as well as the program management level and the compliance level. So we really hope that the flexible nature of the white paper itself will be very usable for you. So with that, let me turn it over to Michael South.
Great, thank you, Min. All right, so real quick, can everybody hear me? Okay, good. I want to make sure they switch this over here. So as Min mentioned earlier, this is still kind of a 200 level, all right? So I am not going to go into how you configure specific services to meet very specific controls. Okay, I'm going to just talk about how we mapped our services to the subcategories and kind of a way of thought of which the services you can use. And then from there, it's really going into working with your solutions architects to really kind of figure out, okay, for your particular use cases, how would you configure which services, right? There's a lot of times, you know, there's many different ways to meet a security control. Right, so you may not necessarily need every single service that I'm going to talk to for a particular area. So it's really kind of at that point in time identifying what are your specific requirements, all right, within the NIST CSF or the controls, and then what specific services you need, and then how you configure those services. So this is just kind of taking you from the very top level down to the intermediate level, and then from there it's really more of a very customer unique discussion as far as what you need to do next. So I'm going to start with the identify. So there's a lot of ways to look at the services of how we map some of these, all right? There are very specific services that are kind of designed to meet very specific security controls or functions. Okay, but there are also services or capabilities or offerings that really by themselves have nothing to do with security, but you could still use in a manner in security. I'm going to cover that. So I'm not going to go into every single service that's listed here and to go into a lot of details. I'm going to just hit on some highlights as we move along, okay? So asset management, right? So CIS top 20 controls, numbers 1 and 2 are inventory. Inventory of your hardware, inventory of your software, okay? the inventory of your assets is one of the most critical aspects of security, because if you don't know what's there, you cannot manage it, secure it, or respond to anything that's going on with it, okay? And that is actually why it's so challenging in our current on-prem environment today, is we don't have the visibility we need in an on-prem environment. And so there's always these challenges with trying to figure out what we really have. I can tell you some nightmares from my experience, trying to manage inventory where we have 2 different hypervisor platforms. We have physical servers still out there throughout, and trying to just bring it all together. Network segmentation, endpoint protection, trying to bring it all together can be very challenging. So now we're not just talking about servers anymore or inventory of the workstations. We're talking about being able to inventory all of your assets now. So we have services, identity and access management, right? Really be able to have the inventory of your users, the groups and the roles that are out there. Systems manager, which you're familiar with some similar capabilities to on-prem, so you're maintaining an inventory of your servers. But now, right, we're really expanding out to IoT. You're seeing IoT really expanding out to not just smart cities or particular industries, but like a lot of companies are starting to embed or use IoT that never had it before. You look at the car manufacturing industry today, right? Cars today are pretty much, they're IoT devices inside cars, okay? And so how do you manage that inventory? Data has always been a big challenge. How do you manage your data? If you have any experiences like I do when it comes to shared drives, network shared drives, they're usually a disaster. There's all kinds of data all over the place, and you don't always know where the sensitive data is or if it's protected properly. So we have services like Amazon Macy that can scour your S3 storage, your simple storage service, looking for sensitive data, social security numbers, credit card numbers, data that you can categorize, and it gives you a report of what data you have before it's ever accessed, right? It can also give you some limited user behavior analytics. So over time, it learns that HR department has an Excel file with the social security numbers on it, and these 2 people access that file Monday through Friday, normal working hours. Oh, and then wait a minute, 2 o'clock in the morning on a weekend, either one of them or some other account is accessing that 500 times in 10 minutes, right? So now you have this anomaly that's occurring. So it helps you understand and identify what's going on within your data. And then code commit or other services like that, right? So we have to kind of take security from the production environment back to the development environment, right? If I'm an attacker, why would I go after the hard protected production environment if I can get in the back door and insert code in the development environment? Right, so now you need to be able to identify your code, especially in an environment like the cloud where we start moving to infrastructure as code, right? We're moving away from physical appliances and devices. Everything is code now. So being able to have the inventory of your code and maintain that, right? So now you're starting to really bring in a much larger picture for asset management. It's no longer just your workstations and servers on the network, okay? Moving over to governance. We have a saying in AWS, you can move fast and stay secure in AWS. And that is absolutely true. But I will caveat that with only if you spend some time in the beginning to figure out your governance strategy and implement your governance. You have to build the guardrails so that the application developers, the business unit managers, they can go down that path as fast as they want because guardrails are in place. And that's that governance. If you don't do that first, that's where you're going to have problems. So you have services to help you with governance, like Service Catalog. So you can use Service Catalog to specify which services are going to be allowed within your environments, which are not. Key management for your encryption keys. How are you going to manage your keys for encryption? Identity and access management, another governance piece. Config. So AWS Config is a configuration management service. Being able to track all the services, the changes within your environment so that you can kind of take a look back at what occurred and when and kind of maintain that visibility. As we start moving into risk assessments, we have Amazon Inspector to conduct a vulnerability scanning of your assets. X-ray for, again, looking at your code. And then Guard Duty, which is our intelligent threat detection service. So this is looking at the risk, constantly assessing operational risk within your environment, all right? Then supply chain. So supply chain, you typically think of supply chain as, that's kind of out of the scope for services, right? But not everything, well, let's put it this way. Security is not a technology problem, right? Security is a business problem. It relies on people, processes, and technology, right? We cannot throw the technology easy button at every security problem. So this is where we're starting to look at, okay, so these are not necessarily services per se that's going to meet a security control, but you can start implementing these to help you with supply chain risk. So the first is your enterprise agreement. Understanding what's in your enterprise agreement with AWS and with your agreements with your partners, okay? Making sure you understand exactly who's going to be responsible for what controls are going to be implemented, and how those processes work. AWS Artifact is a service from us, but it's not what I really consider a true IT service. It's a document repository, so you can download all the third-party audit reports that's being done on us, so you can actually look at the specific controls that were assessed from us and how we did for those controls, okay? And then Marketplace. So we have, Marketplace, so you can have some trusted vendors and get some products from there. So you're not necessarily downloading something from a community area, community areas are fantastic, but you don't always know what's in there, right? What's in the code. So these are some services or some offerings that kind of help you manage that supply chain risk management aspect, okay? For Protect, we talked about identity access management, but look at awareness and training, right? So looking at our partner training services, our training offerings, our certification, these are going to still go into looking at how you can align and support the subcategories within the NIST cybersecurity framework. Data security from encryption, lifecycle management, right? So one of the challenges in an on-prem environment is you kind of you have storage and you're paying for that storage, and you might archive it to some tape backups, but that can always be challenging if you ever have to do a restore. Now, within AWS services like S3 and Glacier, you can have that full lifecycle management of your data. It's always, you can turn on always encryption, but you not really have to worry about some tapes that might get damaged or that you have to restore from later on. You can manage that whole lifecycle. Information protection, looking at cloud formation. The ability to, again, go using that infrastructure as code where you can save your architecture, save your applications as templates, and then deploy, on a moment's notice. So one use case for this, so I support the U.S. government and the DoD quite a bit. So they have to go through the risk management framework or RMF process. So they have to get an authority to operate or ATO letter. And so what the challenge is with that is that every time you have a new application, there's a lot of controls that have to be assessed, right? Now, there's a lot that they can inherit from AWS, but you also want to start chopping what's left over into more manageable blocks, okay? So now, if you have an organization that has to go through this type of process, you can have a standard architecture that maybe it's for a PII architecture, or it's a FedRAMP, or it's a moderate level categorization architecture. And so now every time you have a new application that's going to be deployed, you can just, a quick CLI command, or it's a click of a button, and you can deploy the template into a new environment. So now those controls are already set, and all you have to worry about is the specific application, what you're putting into that new environment, okay? Maintenance, being able to automate your maintenance. From a security perspective, one of the biggest challenges from security is kind of always knowing what the ground truth is, right? What's the baseline, what is known good? And so within the maintenance, being able to manage what's allowed, having that configuration information from config, the AWS Ops works for that DevOps process. You're able to get a better handle on the maintenance that's going on, be able to automate that maintenance, and be able to audit what's going on within that. And then we have the protective technology. So looking at, let's focus on auto-scaling and availability zones, okay? So I'm gonna put these into protective technology for an aspect because of the resilience piece, okay? One of the challenges we have today is the fact that when we lose a server, we're down for a period of time, right? So if you are a sysadmin, if you know sysadmins, right, we treat our servers like pets. We give them names, we feed them, we pet them, we pray to server gods. If they die, we cry. It's a very bad day, right? now we don't have to worry about that anymore, right? Our servers have gone from being pets to being cattle. If something happens to a server, we don't really care about that particular server anymore. We care about the overall application and the mission it's performing. So when you have services like auto scaling to be and the load balancing, right? So if a server fails, you can automatically shift everything over to another server that might be in another data center. All right, it's more of a self-healing architecture. I'm going to go into that a little bit more. Actually, right here. So when you pick the region, any data you put into an AWS region stays there. We do not move, copy, or back up your data into another region. By default, everybody gets DDoS protection for free, which is AWS Shield. And you're going to create that virtual private cloud, that VPC, which is a security boundary around your application. By default, it does not have any internet connectivity. So right now, we have the AWS Web Application Firewall here. To be honest with you, what it's missing is an internet gateway, right? So you're going to select at least 2 availability zones. For those who've ever done risk calculations, you're going to understand why you're going to want to pick at least 3 availability zones. But you're going to select your subnets and the access control list. So that's kind of the equivalent of your stateless firewall capability around each subnet. You're going to have the elastic load balancing service. Now, in an on-prem environment, typically you have a physical appliance, which is a load balancer. Hopefully you have at least 2 or more. But oftentimes they're only load balancing at the top level. So if you have a 3-tier web app, they're only load balancing between the web servers. Right? If you have a failure on an app server, then the traffic that's going down that path is dying at the application, at the app server, right? So you have half of your customers that are no longer being serviced, they're being timed out. Now you have load balancing within each tier of your application much more cost effectively. You have the auto scaling group. You have the security group that you're going to put around your tiers. So this is the equivalency of a stateful firewall capability, okay? And so this is where, within this type of environment, this is a self-healing environment, okay? So again, when I said if a server crashes, it's okay, right? So the load balancer will redirect everything over to the other side and immediately spin up a new server to take the place of the one that just crashed, okay? For security purposes, if you want to isolate the failed server so you can do some forensics on it, or your developers want to take a look at it, you can do that. You can automate that entire process, right? So before, typically, especially where I come from on the government side, we typically don't fund extra servers sitting around. Right, so when a server crashes, there's only one requirement: get that back up and operational. We don't have the time to take a good look at it. We might image it and then try to see what we can do from that image from a security forensics, but we don't really have time to take a look at everything. Now we can do both, right? We can replace the one that went down, and we can still take a look at the one that failed, okay? You're gonna want to encrypt in transit. You want to encrypt at rest. And that's on storage, and then in the database. And then within a region, we have sub 2 millisecond latency, so you can achieve that synchronous data replication between the data centers. Okay, so this is how you start kind of building out that high availability architecture. That's going to be, you're going to have the protections in place, but you're also going to have that resiliency. This is what allows you to shift from a reactive disaster recovery risk model to a proactive resiliency risk model, right? Not that you're going to get risk to zero. You can never get risk to zero. But anytime you can mitigate risk on the front end, especially at lower cost, then you're going to be in a much better place, because we all know how well backup restorations work, right? So that's what we want to do. We want to get that. We want to mitigate on the front end. All right. So for detect, we have, I think, I'm going to focus on Amazon Guard Duty, right? I think everybody's kind of heard about that already, our intelligent threat detection service. This is what's looking at what's going on in your environment, but it's adding that additional context of the threat intel. So before, you might know you're being scanned, but what type of scan is it? Who is it coming from? Which scan is more risky than others, right? As soon as you stand up a web server on the internet, it's being scanned, right? Search engines are scanning it to add to their list. You might have cyber criminals scanning it. You might have nation states scanning it. There's different types of scans. So now with GuardDuty, you can say, okay, this is a type of scan. This is a more of a malicious type of scan. It's coming from this IP address. It's a known cyber criminal. Maybe it's coming from this particular country. So now you have some additional context, so you can say, okay, this is what I want to focus on a little bit more. Okay. We have IoT Device Defender, right? So we had a tabletop exercise earlier today, where now you're able to provide some of those detective controls within your IoT, trying to look for anomalous behavior of your IoT devices, okay? We have our security continuous monitoring. All right, so if you're familiar with the risk management framework, one of the things that did, it added the requirement for continuous monitoring, right? That's kind of the one thing that's always been lacking from compliance, right? Compliance was, you meet the security controls, you get audited, and then you don't know if you're compliant for another 3 years later when you get audited again. Right, or 1 year, depending on your cycle, right? Continuous monitoring, you need to know every day, or every hour, every minute, depending of how you are with compliance, and not just compliance, but with security. Are the controls that you put in place staying in place? Or have they been modified? So we have the services, again, such as GuardDuty, Macy for looking at your data, X-Ray, again, for your code, all right? So now you're able to implement that continuous monitoring within your environment. And then the detection processes, you'll see I have AWS Lambda. So detection is fantastic, it's absolutely critical, all right? But you cannot rely on detection when it comes to security. You have to be able to mitigate the threats, right? And so we see quite often where, customers, in my experience, we have a security operations center. So typically there are analysts, security analysts, tiers 1 through 4. Tier 1 is typically the young person just out of school, super motivated, super smart. They get to the job, they're all excited, and they're told, sit here, watch this screen, don't touch anything. If something happens, follow this playbook, right? Follow this checklist. If you have a checklist, that needs to be automated, right? Because now you have somebody who's, again, rather inexperienced, watching things come in, and they're trying to figure out what's important, what's not important. Right? And then they got to figure out what to take action on. So even if you go from the tier 1 analyst to the tier 4 analyst and they really know what they're doing, guess what? They're still slow, right? They cannot beat the speed of the computer, right? Of the IT. They cannot beat the speed of the attackers, right? So this is where we're going to start to automate. And this is where it's going to come in on the response planning. So you have stuff like config, where it can watch for specific changes in your environment, and if a change is made that's not authorized, it can actually go back and revert it back to the approved configuration. Okay. You have functions like Lambda. So Lambda is our serverless function service. So when a particular event triggers, you can have a function triggered to revert something back or change the state based off an event. Communications. You have service to service or system to system communications, you have your internal communications, and you have your external communications. Again, the ability to automate as much as possible those type of communications to let the systems and the people know what's going on is critical. The ability to analyze what's happened and what's going on, so you can be able to take a look at, one, was it just, a bug in the code, or was it an actual security event? What do we need to change either in the code or protections to go back and mitigate that so it doesn't happen again? The other mitigations and improvements. Now, I don't have any particular service listed for improvements because that's really a process. Now, we have services that can help you with this, right? But that's really where that process goes. And so this is what it can look like. So I highlight on Amazon GuardDuty, if it detects that particular malicious scan, it'll create a CloudWatch event. All right. So if you have you can have a Lambda function, maybe you call it the cyber criminal, web server scan function. So as soon as it creates the event that a known cyber criminal is scanning your web server, it can trigger the Lambda function. The Lambda function can take that IP address and insert it into your web application firewall filtering rule. Right? So now, in a very short period of time, you've mitigated that threat. No human action required. Right? This would take a human, even your tier 4 person, from the time they looked at that one alert, because they're looking at a lot of alerts, it probably still took them 20, 30 minutes or longer to implement this, to figure out what it was going on, to validate it, and then to implement the mitigation, right? Now you can automate this. Now you can say, okay, well this is great, but the attacker can just change your IP address, right? So then now we're playing whack-a-mole. Well, again, do you want to waste human resources playing whack-a-mole, right? That's not value added. So you can continue to automate the process. So you might still be a few seconds or a minute behind, but at least you're not wasting human resources to do that. And of course, you can build in additional logic, okay, within your automation. So if I see a number of IPs from the same subnet over a short period of time, just block the whole subnet, maybe for 30 minutes or an hour. There's other things I can do to start building more logic into my automation. In addition, you can automate actions with partner solutions, add it to your next generation firewall, add it to a communications channel. Another thing is, from a security operations perspective, one of the biggest challenges is when security operations makes a change to the environment because they have to mitigate a threat. Those changes rarely make it back to your configuration change management database, right? So now security is making changes, and whether it's your developers, your DevOps, your IT operations, your configuration manager, they're not happy because changes were made and they don't know exactly what was changed and when. Okay, so now don't just automate the mitigation, automate the updating of your configuration change management database, automate the communications, right? Automate as much as you can to take humans out of it, right? Now, you can add a human stop gate. If you have a need for a human to make an actual judgment call, which is what we do best, you can add a human stop gate into this. All right, so for example, in this particular example, if you have a SOC analyst that needs to make a decision, do I want to ignore this event? Maybe there's some context that I have that the system doesn't, or do I want to kind of have choices to be made? You can have everything automated up to a point, give the SOC analyst choices. Do I ignore? Do I add it to the WAF? Do I go ahead and block the whole subnet? What do I want to do? They can make that judgment call, click the button, and then automate the implementation, right? So at least at that point in time, everything is presented to the analyst to make that judgment, and they're not doing the research and implementation themselves. So in the last piece on the recover, this is probably, I think, one of the greatest benefits of using the cloud in AWS is because of infrastructure code again, right? So we talked about before, if you lost a server, you can replace a server, but what happens if you lost an entire environment, right? If you had that entire environment saved as a template, you can have that entire environment back up and running in a few minutes. If it's really massive and really complex, maybe an hour. But the point is, you can have everything back up and operational without a lot of heartache relatively soon in comparison to what you can do in an on-prem environment. And so with that, greatly appreciate your time today. We know it's late, so get back a few minutes, so make it to happy hour. And the Min and I will stick around if anybody has any questions. So thank you, have a great night.